Okay, to be continued. So let's dive in. Lecture 6, Urbanization and the Transformation of the Earth. I'm going to take a swig of my caffeinated beverage before we dive in, because it's going to be, we're going to cover a lot of ground in the next hour and 15 minutes. Okay, cheers. So here's the structure. I want to talk a little bit about the problem of what do we mean when we talk about the transformation of the earth or nature in relation to urbanization. Like, it's actually not self-evident. And then the bulk of the lecture is going to be on Mumford. I have a lot to say about Mumford, who, has anybody read Mumford before today? Just a show of hands. Anyone read Mumford? Only Simon, no one. Ah, and Joshua, right on, The City and History. Nice, you've got the original book cover too. You've got like the 1966 old school book cover, the old edition, beauty. And has anybody heard of Mumford before today? Hands, anybody? Only one. Okay, beautiful. This is, for me, it's actually super fun when I'm going to be talking about like a classic, really interesting thinker, and you approach it with like a completely fresh state of mind because you've never encountered the author before. So, okay, so that's helpful to know. And then probably as the lecture winds down, I'll say a little bit about the Woolman and then the other approach to urban metabolism. But in some sense, Mumford is the main event. The stuff on the operational landscapes of the Capitalocene with Nikos, it's kind of that framework that we develop in the essay informs the reading of Mumford that I'm going to give you. So it's not like it's a separate topic. It's kind of part of the whole analysis, and we can hopefully get into it. If not today, then the framework with Nikos Katsikis is one that really informs my whole approach to all the work we're doing. So it's good just to kind of get familiar with it, also in order to understand where I'm coming from. So I went ahead and put it like in the gray, just because it's not, I'm not going to do a separate, discussion of it for today. So let me just give you some background parameters for this conversation. So the first one is that if we were talking about cities and environment in the 1960s, it would be a conversation about different environmental dimensions of the city, but they're probably, depending on where you're doing it, it wouldn't be framed around the sense of like a global emergency, an apocalypse. And I want to argue, I mean, again, it's a political question, but I'm just telling you where I'm coming from. There's no way to talk about this question today, the city, urbanization, and the environment, except in relationship to the emergencies, the ricocheting, cascading, brutal, devastating emergencies that are basically cascading across planet Earth with devastating consequences for human beings and for non-human life, and indeed for the Earth system itself. So I'm not a catastrophist. In other words, a theoretical tradition that just declares everything is kind of going to hell, as it were. But nonetheless, I think it would be intellectually and politically naive to underplay the seriousness of what we're living through right now. And again, like, it's almost like the new normal. Like every time we read the newspaper, every season, there's a new round of catastrophes with devastating consequences for people's lives, generating massive population displacement, climate refugees, and property damage, like devastation of the built environment, not just along coastlines, but really across the interior as well in the context of wildfires around the world. So again, it's familiar. This is the eye of Hurricane Katrina. It seems like ages ago, but that was kind of one of the first really mega storms. And it hit a big, US metropolitan region with devastating consequences. And after Katrina, like I've been a professor for a while, but I can just report that I noticed that so many of my doctoral students started working on cities, environment, and climate. It just raised the consciousness and the urgency of the field of critical urban studies in ways that were quite remarkable. So the devastation, obviously highly racialized and classed forms of suffering. That's been going on outside the Euro-American world for at least a century and a half, if not longer, in relation to the kind of environmental disasters induced by capitalism. But increasingly, they're being globalized. So Hurricane Sandy was another big one, at least in the US context, with a direct hit on New York City. I was in Miami in the midst of Hurricane Irma, which actually, luckily for me and my family, didn't take the path depicted in this particular diagram, but that's what we were anticipating. And, a lot of us probably in this room have had experiences, whether of hurricanes or other serious environmental emergencies that caused us existential dread. And if you haven't had it yet, just as a human being on planet Earth, at some point, sooner or later, there's just so many cascading emergencies. It's like our new normal. This was Hurricane Maria, New York City after Sandy, New York City after Sandy. These are just, these are thousands of images from around the world that one could use. Fukushima, the tsunami in Japan that then disabled the Fukushima nuclear power plant. So it's a cascading disaster. In other words, a tsunami and then a nuclear disaster with catastrophic, the Pacific Ocean then looks like a small pond when you actually look at the sort of toxic emissions. And unfortunately, that's not an exceptional situation. In other words, this in some ways is emblematic of the interdependencies, not only social and economic, but also environmental, that characterize the modern world, which we are transforming through our particular mode of living. Urbanism, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, is part of what we need to debate about. But again, this is a parameter for the world that we live in. And again, there are examples. I've just chosen some mainly North American examples, but the typhoons in Southeast Asia and South Asia. This was Hurricane Michael. This sort of sense of just the hurricanes themselves are changing. In other words, I grew up in Central Florida, so I remember hurricanes from when I was a kid, decades ago. And, there are some big hurricanes, but the scale, the frequency, and the volatility seems to be intensifying. Wildfires. This is Australia. I think it was last year with just, maybe it was 2 years ago. No, it was last year. The devastating wildfires, the temperature change, generating massive wildfires so that the entire, most of the Australian population is on the coastline, pretty much right along the fire rim. So the entire country was basically in flames. The U.S. West, Northwest, and Pacific Northwest, and South, and just West Coast, just months ago, completely covered in flames. And I don't know if anyone in this room is in California right now or was in California during this period, but I have many close friends who, on Zoom, and they're basically locked in. And, the pandemic itself, there's a whole conversation to be had, and I have a lot to say about it, is arguably also an expression of our environmental emergency in terms of it's not just something that came from nowhere and then just somehow got into human bodies. The moment of zoonosis, when the pathogen jumps from a non-human to a human host, if you actually study what's going on in terms of land use and deforestation and the commercialization of wild animals around the world, not only in China, those processes are intensifying the severity and the frequency of emergent infectious disease like COVID-19. There have been a lot of emergent infectious diseases prior to that, SARS, MERS, H5N1, et cetera. And unfortunately, from what the scientists write, there are more coming. And it's not just a random thing from some exterior nature. It's actually related to how we've reorganized agriculture, land use, forests around the world. So literally the fact that we are in this Zoom box is itself an expression of the environmental emergencies in the plural that we're living through. So there's no way to think about, what we're talking about reading Mumford, even though that seems like a halcyon moment from 50 plus years ago when he was writing about it in this more reflexive way. To write about the topics that Mumford was writing about in the 1930s, the 1940s, and then the essay that you read, 1965, I believe, or no, it was 1956. Today we must engage with these issues and with urgency, with moral urgency, with political urgency, and with, I also want to emphasize, all the scholarly capacity that we can muster. Because I believe this isn't just, as with so much in our field of urban studies, it's not just a question of, oh, we're curious and we want to understand it, even though curiosity goes a long way. It's existentially important for the future of the earth, for the future of life on earth, human and non-human, that we understand these processes and how urbanization is enmeshed with them. So I take it pretty seriously for that reason. I think our field has something to contribute because cities and urbanization processes are part of the problem. Maybe, according to Mumford, they're also part of the solution. And that's a topic we'll come back to in the very last lecture of this class, where we'll look more directly at some of the literature on cities and climate change and sustainability, which I'll just say in advance, I have a somewhat critical angle on, but I think this stuff is really important. So we've got to get clear on the positions people are taking. Okay, so that's one background. Another background is just we've got to talk for a moment before we get into Mumford about what is nature. So I'm laughing because it's like, oh my God, it's a huge philosophical question that people have been debating about for a very long time. And there's no way I can go into the depths of different conceptual philosophical frameworks and all the nuance of the debate. Even today, the debate continues to rage against the background of what I just described. But I do need to make a basic distinction just to kind of get us oriented, which hopefully will resonate given that you've already read the Mumford. So let's just make a simple distinction. Very simple. Again, there's a lot more to it than this, but let's just make a simple distinction just to get ourselves oriented. Let's distinguish two different conceptions of nature. One is the idea of, like you may recall when we were reading David Harvey, I read a quote where he referred to virgin nature. And I said, oh, that's a problematic assumption. So I'm not sure whether David Harvey really believes that there's anything like virgin nature. It's an interesting metaphor to choose. But the idea that I think he was alluding to was the notion of like nature, the non-human world, whether of living things or just materials, metabolic processes that are just simply outside of social, they're not directly mediated through or influenced by social dynamics. So it's pre-social, it's non-human. So it could be something like, I don't know, the photosynthesis of a plant. It's just kind of like, well, it's just what the plant does, and human beings haven't really affected that. Or you could choose lots of different examples from, wildlife or, the ecology of a mountain range or the ecology of the ocean. And you could argue that it's pre-social or non-social. Whether we can sustain that position or not is part of the debate. But anyway, that's one conception of nature. So just the idea is that there's human beings on the one side and there's nature on the other side. Simple dualism. On the other hand, the concept which I want to develop with you all in this discussion is the idea of nature as a metabolized product of social action. So it doesn't mean that like social action produces the mountain or produces gravity or produces photosynthesis, but simply that all of the metabolic biogeophysical processes on the planet are themselves impacted through the social dynamics, the sort of social processes associated with different societies. And just to give that a little more content, before I give it a little more content, the idea here is simply that instead of operating with a rigid dualism, society on the one side and nature on the other side, you're interested in a kind of dialectical, mutual co-constitution. So in other words, non-human processes might be influenced by what human beings do, what societies do, how societies unfold and develop, but by the same token, in some ways even more urgently for us, human society itself is premised upon the transformation of non-human life and non-human processes. So like the food in our bellies, the water that we drink, the energy that we consume, building all the materials that we're presupposing in order to have the technology, in order to have this conversation, it's basically transformations of elements from the sun's energy that enables life to exist to what we consume on a daily basis or what we consume in order to build the built environment itself. So it's not like nature is exterior, we're transforming nature in order to live in society, and in so doing, we are ourselves transformed. And this is an idea that has a long lineage. And I just want to recall a number of you, if not everyone, has read Marx and Engels, the German ideology. And they actually developed this concept of metabolized nature in the German ideology. Natalia was in my core class last term, and we actually read this together. But I know a lot of you have taken courses in the core where you've read Marx and Engels. But let me just remind you, there's a famous example in the German ideology, which Natalia and I and our group, we discussed at length last term, but I find it just such a great way to illustrate this point. I want to just remind you of it. So Marx is talking about, and Engels, they're talking about a cherry tree. And they're criticizing this philosopher of the 19th century named Feuerbach, who views the cherry tree. He gives the example of a cherry tree, and it's just, he's looking at the cherry tree and it's like, oh, this is nature and I'm a human being. And Marx and Engels are saying that's ludicrous. That's completely wrong. And here's what they say. He, Feuerbach, does not see that the world surrounding him is not something directly given and the same from all eternity, but it's the product of industry and the state of society in the sense that it is an historical product, the result of the activity of a whole succession of generations, each standing on the shoulders of the preceding one, developing further its industry and its commerce and modifying its social order according to its changed needs. And then he says, they say, even the objects of the simplest sensuous certainty are given to him, Feuerbach, only through social development, industry, and commercial relationships. And then here's the cherry tree. The cherry tree, like almost all fruit trees, was transplanted into our zone by commerce a few centuries ago. As we know, and only by this action of a particular society in a particular time has it become a sensuous certainty for Feuerbach. So what he's saying, it's a beautiful, crisp formulation. Anything, like look outside your window if you have a window, and whatever tree you see, or if you see a bird flying, or you see just anything out there, even the bird's migration patterns, I don't know about that, but it could be that that's also influenced by societal development. Like birds' paths change if there's the air quality or the buildings, but certainly the cherry tree in this example, you know, Feuerbach just thinks, oh, it's the cherry tree, it's completely outside of history, it's just nature. And Marx is saying, actually, if you look at the history of the cherry tree, you'll see that it was brought, presumably to Western Europe, through commercial exchange so that you started growing the cherry tree in a zone where it wasn't previously grown. So even the landscape itself, like I'll give you one other example. I have a colleague named Jane Hutton, who's an architect, and she wrote a book about the material flows involved in the production of Central Park in New York City. So you might think, Central Park, it's all these trees and all this grass and all this stone, and it must have been there and they just reorganized it. And you can see that now you have Central Park. And what Jane argued in this book, it's called Reciprocal Landscapes, is that all the stuff from Central Park, it literally came from all over the world. So she did an analysis of like from Peru to northern Canada, the stone quarry, all the materials had to be transported. So you might look at Central Park and think, like what a beautiful natural environment. And she's kind of saying, well, actually, no, it's basically like Feuerbach's cherry tree. It's completely constructed. So it's a way of thinking of nature, what we think of as nature, as itself mediated, and the nature of that mediation is part of what has to be specified through social, political, economic processes. The key outcome of that argument is the concept of historical nature. So I didn't put it on my slide, but you might want to write that down. So instead of thinking of nature as just outside of society, eternal, nature itself, the non-human realm of life and material and energetic flow, is itself, it has a history. And that history is intermeshed with the history of human society. So methodologically, that may seem like really simple, but it actually has some pretty profound implications. Because it's not just cities interacting with some exterior, ahistorical, fixed, law-like environment. It's actually, cities are co-evolving with a broader earth system that human beings and our societies in turn transform. So it just basically makes, instead of nature with a capital N, historical natures. We have to actually unpack what's going on outside of the human world and how human societies co-evolve and co-transform with that which we, with the broader environment that we're a part of. So it's not just an ahistorical environment, it's an historical environment. So I'm going to skip, I have a couple other quotes from Marx, but I'm going to skip it. Let me introduce one other key concept, which is going to be pretty essential to my reading of Mumford. And this is also a concept that one could say quite a lot about. This is a topic of much debate and theoretical polemic in contemporary environmental studies. So I have a lot to say about it, but I just want you to be familiar with the concept. And this too is worth writing down just because it's a good concept to have in your toolkit of concepts. And that is the concept of the metabolic rift. And the term itself was used by Marx famously in volume 3 of Capital. And I'm just going to give you the quote. He says, capitalist property relations provoke an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, a metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. The word for metabolism in German is Stoffwechsel. And literally Stoff means stuff, it means things, and Wechsel means like a change of form. So like if you're changing your dollar to the euro, you would Wechsel, you would change your money from the dollar form to the euro form. So it's a Wechsel. It doesn't mean the thing disappears, you're simply mutating the form of its appearance. It's the same word for changing money. So like the currency exchange, cambio, Wechsel, it's like a cambio, it's like a currency exchange. And that's the word for metabolism. It doesn't mean that like whatever is being transformed disappears, but it's the constant change of the form of materials, of energy, of labor. And what Marx is saying is that capitalist property relations provoke a rift, a kind of fissure, a break, a disjuncture in that Stoffwechsel. So there's a change of form going on, but it's almost like it's a moment of disruption. The word rift may or may not be familiar. You're probably familiar with it as a geological, like a geological formation where there's like a break between two, like in a, I guess it's in a mountain range. There'd be like a rift between two structures. I'm not a geologist, so I shouldn't go any further. But it is a geological word, but it's also a metaphor that just means a disjuncture. So basically, it's a disruption in the regenerative material flows and nutrient cycles that underpin previous social formations. So earlier I was saying that nature is metabolized by human social action. So the idea of the rift adds a further layer to that. It's not just a metabolism, a Stoffwechsel, where everybody, it just keeps vexeling, it keeps changing back and forth, but that something with this vexel, something with this change of form generates a disjuncture, a rupture, a disruption, which has consequences that are problematic. And I just want to share with you, again, there's a big literature on this concept, and one of the leading thinkers and has a very specific position in this is a colleague of mine named Andreas Malm. He's a Swedish environmental scholar. He's written a lot of brilliant work. And in this passage, he summarizes it pretty well. So I just want to read Andreas's summary and then try to explain it. So he says that it's basically a concept developed in a certain Marxian line of inquiry into environmental problems. He names a few people: John Bellamy Foster, Richard York, Brett Clark, and others. But the thing I want to draw to your attention is this. It can be summed up in the following condensed sequence. So here it is. Brace yourself. Nature consists of biophysical processes and cycles. So does society. Human bodies must engage in metabolic exchanges with non-human nature. So in this sense, they're saying everything is nature. Human beings are part of nature. We also involve geophysical processes, certainly biological processes, in order to reproduce ourselves on a daily basis. We eat, we drink, we produce waste, we breathe. We're part of nature in that sense, just like plants and just like non-human animals. Malm continues, that need not be particularly harmful to any of the parties. However, over the course of history, the relations through which humans have organized their Stoffwechsel, their metabolism, might be fractured and forcibly rearranged so that they not only harm the people disadvantaged by this change, but also at the very same time, they disturb the processes and cycles of nature. A metabolic rift has opened up. Let me summarize. Again, a lot can be said about it, but I want to summarize the key takeaways. The metabolic rift is doubly disruptive. It undermines the society or people within the society. It's disruptive or destructive to people within the society. Most metabolic rifts in the history of capitalism have inflicted particularly violent, disruptive, and even genocidal consequences on people of color and racialized populations. And of course, it's also classed, working people. Like, we can connect that up to climate change pretty quickly. But the first disruption of the double disruption is it inflicts damage, it inflicts harm onto people. And again, it's not all people. The concept of the Anthropocene, which you may have heard of, implies that, oh, it's all of us, but actually it's pretty unevenly distributed, and it's inflicted, according to this tradition, by capital, and the damage is shouldered unevenly by people who are made vulnerable by this particular system. And that takes, of course, a deeply racialized form. But the other damage, the other disruption, is that the very cycles and processes outside of the human world are disrupted. So when we say the Earth system is being disrupted, or that biodiversity is being undermined, or that the Earth is heating up and that all life forms, not only human beings, are being affected by it. So the metabolic rift, it's a rift whose consequences don't just act back upon the agents who produced it, human beings, they actually ricochet beyond society. And they inflict damage, disruption, and even extinction. Like, if you look at the history of extinction in the last 150 years, like mass extinction events Of course, there's a long history of extinctions in the history of life, the dinosaurs and so forth, but the intensity and the scale of mass extinctions of non-human creatures, of non-human species, has just escalated like drastically in the last 50 years. So there's something going on here. That's the metabolic rift. It's the double rift. Damage onto human beings, unevenly distributed, and damage onto non-human systems, and indeed onto the Earth system as a whole. Okay, a couple other, I just want to derive a couple consequences of this, and then I'm going to dive into Mumford. But I think this is necessary kind of foundations for trying to make sense of this literature. Otherwise, it's very easy to get disoriented. So in the study of cities and environment, again, summarizing a very broad field in very simple terms, but just for the sake of orienting us in our inquiry, I want to distinguish two conceptual frameworks. The first one, which is on the slide, an externalist or dualist framework, and the second one, you won't be surprised, is a processual, relational, dialectical framework. So let me explain the distinction. The externalist framework or the dualist framework implies, it's basically this first conception of nature as pre-social. It presupposes that first conception of nature. So from this point of view, the city is interacting with nature, and it's appropriating materials like food, water, energy from nature, from the environment, and then the operations, the building and development of the city externalizes some of its waste products on an external natural world, the hinterlands. So in this particular model, it's totally externalist. And what I mean by that is that nature is external to the city. The city is human and social, and nature is non-human and asocial. So that's a model that's presupposed in a lot of the literature. To some extent, we might ask whether Abel Woolman in his metabolism article is working with this model. Mumford is not, although we're going to talk about what is his model, because it's actually pretty complicated. But that's one model, and it'll become more clear. Let me contrast it to the other one, the dialectical relational one. So here, it's basically everything is metabolized nature. The city and the non-city. City building, it's not interacting with a non-human nature. City building itself is a way of reorganizing, we might say of rifting, in the sense of the metabolic rift, the Stoffwechsel, the metabolism of life. It generates particular pathways of metabolic transformation. So instead of thinking of the city as outside of nature and interacting with it, we need to think about the process of city building as a way of organizing or reforming, rechanneling the metabolism of life. So again, remember, please, the discussion from last time on David Harvey, and I had a whole long discussion about the city as process, not as thing, and how it's getting out of that process of that thing ontology and thinking about processes. This is the same terrain here, but now thinking about it in relation to the non-human. So it's urbanization processes generating particular forms of socio-environmental metabolism rather than the city interacting with a non-human nature. So from this point of view, the city does not act upon nature. We're dealing with the process of urbanization, which metabolizes human and non-human material, energy, and labor. So I made that diagram. I kind of like it. What do y'all think? Anyway, I don't know if the diagram really captures it very well, but I just wanted to get at the idea of there's a dynamism. Like in this diagram, so in this diagram, basically city is here, and that's human and social, and nature is over here. There's a dualism. It's like you could draw a line. You could draw a line right here. You know, it's like there's a barrier, and it's just constantly interacting across that barrier. And what I did here is basically it's not that everything is the same, but simply that everything is interconnected. It's not that there's no difference between human society and a mountain, or human society and, I don't know, a school of fish, in a pond or in the ocean. Of course there is. There's all kinds of differences in the world. So I'm not trying to flatten everything into the same and just saying, oh, it's all X. No, the point of this framework, this dialectical relational processual framework, is to say that we need to look at the interconnections instead of presupposing that we have like two billiard balls that are interacting with one another. There's intermeshed co-evolutionary relationships that then need to be unpacked. So again, recall the point I made a few minutes ago about historical natures, historical environments. This is what I'm trying to get at with my little squiggle of a diagram here. The idea that like urbanization co-evolves with various kinds of historical environments. The historical environments, whether it's the oceans, whether it's the atmosphere, whether it's the soil, co-evolve and co-transform through the ways in which urbanization, city building processes, and their metabolic requirements contribute to transformations of the water, of the air, of the atmosphere, and of the soil, and much more. Okay, so that's the direction we want to go with Mumford. Here are the questions on the table, and these are big ones. This goes way beyond this lecture, but I think you've seen, I like to pose. The point of doing these readings is not just to say, oh, here's what author X, Y, or Z says, but to pose the big questions and hopefully encourage all of you to like get inspired and devote your powerful brains to thinking about these questions in your future work, whether as scholars or practitioners, because we need to understand these questions. So these are the point of this class is to bring you into these questions. Here are the big ones. In what ways do cities and city building processes involve the remaking of non-human environments and landscapes? How has urbanization transformed the Earth system? Have such transformations been destructive? Have they entailed a metabolic rift, maybe many metabolic rifts? And if so, how, where, why, and for whom, and with what consequences? I mean, that's basically my opening presentation about the climate emergencies. Obviously, I do think that there are many metabolic rifts and that they're devastating and that we need to understand them. But that's one of the questions on the table. How has this metabolism evolved? In other words, we're saying that it's historical natures, historical dynamics of urbanization. So it's not just, you can't just make a generalization. Here's how it is. It's evolving, the connections and the scale. In other words, a big part of Mumford's essay is about the scale of that metabolism in Neolithic times was relatively regionally circumscribed. In the Roman Empire, it got much bigger. And today it's the metabolism of urbanization is basically, I would argue, coextensive with the metabolism of the Earth system. Like there's no, I get in trouble for saying this in scholarship, but this is what I think. There's no outside. It doesn't mean everything is the same and it's just a simple film of urbanization, but I don't think there's an outside. Whether it's Mount Everest or the garbage patch in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, it's interconnected with the global urban system. So it's evolved, and the scale, the spatiality of it is part of what's evolved. How does it articulate to cities and hinterlands? In other words, cities rely on supplies of various kinds for their populations and for their economic activities. Where does all that stuff come from? And again, you can make generalizations about certain times and places, but those what we traditionally call city hinterland relations, they've mutated drastically. And that's of course what Nikos and I tried to deal with in that short piece of ours that you read. What is distinctive about modern urbanization and the metabolism of modern urbanization? Mumford believes it's a radical break. Is it related to fossil fuels and our carbon? Is it related to mechanization? Is it related to something else? This is a big debate. And equally important, urgently, maybe the most important is, can this metabolism, whatever it is, I mean, I do think of it as fossil urbanization because I think my particular take on it is that without fossil fuels, the whole fabric of urbanization will be completely different. There's all kinds of social, political, spatial configurations that are directly contingent upon the generalized extraction deployment of fossil fuels within and beyond cities. That changes, as Naomi Klein said of climate change, it changes everything. And I would say the same thing about what caused climate change, which is basically fossil capital. But the question is, can it be reconfigured? In other words, if we go post-fossil, if we do wind and solar and we literally keep all that fossil fuel in the ground and don't burn carbon anymore, what would the consequences of that be for the nature and the geography of urbanization and for urbanism, the Worthian question, urban life? Would you still have the Zimmelian, Worthian situation if we were powered by wind and solar and muscle power and water, or for that matter, nuclear? I mean, nuclear is a whole other puzzle in terms of energy. So anyway, there's a lot to be said about energetics of urbanization, which at some point I'll teach a class on because it's central to my own concerns. But certainly the question of reconfiguring the metabolism of contemporary urbanization, among other things, there are many dimensions to it, but energy is central. So anyway, there's a lot to be said about that. The main approaches for today are Mumford, who offers what he calls a natural history of cities, and offers us a kind of ecological regionalist critique. And then the urban metabolism studies are kind of more technical accounts of inputs and outputs, which I think are very useful, although in certain ways they also have blind spots, as I hope to explain. And again, I'm not going to get into the last one, but it's me and Nikos, but it's Urban Theory Lab, which we set up at Harvard when I was there. And we're going to be setting up Urban Theory Lab Chicago, which is precisely about all these questions that I just posed, pretty much. That's the UTL, we call it UTL, the UTL Chicago's agenda. So if you're interested in this stuff, we're just setting it up because I'm still in my second quarter here, but by next year, the lab should be up and running, and hopefully there'll be opportunities for students, including college students, to get involved in our work. So if you're into this stuff, then please keep in touch, because we're building this lab precisely in order to do research on all these questions about the metabolism of capital and the metabolism of urbanization. So, okay. Before I go any further, let me just pause. I just covered, like everything I just covered was like pretty intense. There's a lot going on. And let me just, I do want to make sure I get through Mumford in the next 27, 28 minutes, but let me just ask for a moment. Do you have any questions of clarification? Is anyone confused about anything? And if you are, I don't blame you, because it's confusing stuff. Hopefully I've been clear, but that doesn't mean that the issues are easy to understand. Any questions at all or comments? Okay, I'll take that as a sign that y'all want me to keep going, and you're like, tell us about Mumford, we want to know. Is that correct? Are you guys okay? I can't tell what's going on in this room. Are y'all just being like, ah, like there's too much? Somebody give me some kind of feedback. I'm feeling a little bit disoriented because I just can't read. Normally in a seminar room, I can read the vibe, but right now I can't. People are smiling, which is good, but.
Yeah, I'm doing okay. It's, yeah, I'm ready to move
You're
forward.
ready to keep going, okay. Yeah. Does Robert's comment capture the general mood in the room? Like keep going, okay, good. Okay, just checking. I mean, because I'm here not just to like project my ideas, I want to make sure that you guys are with me. So it sounds like the answer is yes, and please proceed. So, okay, good. Let me go back to my share screen. And right on. Okay, can y'all see the Mumford screen? Can you see it? Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so Mumford, let's talk Mumford. So nobody's read Mumford before, or most of you haven't. He's a really fascinating character. He lived, actually both he and Abel Woolman both, I didn't plan the class this way to assign two authors who lived into their 90s, but both Mumford and Woolman lived to a very ripe old age, dying at like 95, Mumford, and I think Woolman died at age 96. So I don't know, work on this stuff and you'll live a long, hopefully happy life. He was an architecture critic. He wrote a lot of wonderful articles for the New Yorker. He sometimes wrote polemical articles for the New Yorker. He wrote a really nasty review of Jane Jacobs's book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. But despite not liking that essay very much, he was pretty obnoxious to Jane Jacobs and condescending. He's a wonderful critic of contemporary urbanism, or what was then contemporary urbanism, mid-20th century New York City. He lived in New York City, settled in the region. He was a planner, he was a historian. He wrote lots of books, among which I've just listed some of my favorites: Technics and Civilization, Culture of Cities, and the City in History. He wrote a lot about technology in modern society. These are some of his books that are kind of about urbanism and architecture. He wrote a book about the highway and the city. So he lived the same way that, like, at least my generation, for y'all, you grew up with the internet probably, but I grew up, like, I lived through the internet revolution. So he lived through the highway revolution. So he wrote about the highway at a moment when, like, instead of just having country roads, like, he grew up with the automobile. He was a kid when the automobile was being rolled out in the United States. But the highway after World War II was a whole other thing. So he was writing about, like, the highway and what does it mean for society, the way that, like, people who lived through the internet revolution write about this new technology, trying to make sense of it. So he was that kind of an author, not only writing about erudite, scholarly, historical topics, but also trying to use his knowledge to understand some of the changes that were going on in his own time. His more scholarly books, Technics and Civilization is one of my favorites. It's an amazing book. The Culture of Cities, the book that Joshua showed us his copy of, The City in History. Pretty classic. And in my other class that I'll teach next winter, Sociology of Urban Planning, Cities, Territories, Environments, we read some of this book on the industrial city. The essay that you read for today was from a really remarkable conference. This book is a 2-volume book published in '55. It's from a conference that was at Princeton. And to me, it's amazing because in our time, we talk about the Anthropocene as this new concept, this new moment of human beings changing the face of the earth. 1955, they were basically talking about the Anthropocene and what we today call, I'm not a fan of that term, but what a lot of people today call the Anthropocene without using the term. And this is just the conference summary from the foundation that funded it, I think the Wenner-Gren organization. Bill is the first large-scale evaluation of what has happened and what is happening to the earth under man's impress. Man's role in changing the face of the earth attempted to solicit viewpoints from all fields of knowledge upon man's capacity to transform his physical biological environment and upon his cumulative and irreversible alterations of the earth. Sounds a bit like the Anthropocene to me. I mean, that's basically the definition of the Anthropocene, is that human beings are transforming our physical biological environments and cumulatively and irreversibly altering the earth. Like, that's a pretty good definition, at least first cut of the Anthropocene. And this is 1955, people. So it's pretty fascinating. I found a copy of that book on abebooks.com for like 15 bucks. So, and actually it might have been $5. So they're out there. It's a pretty amazing book. And actually none other than Abel Woolman, who you read for today, he was also at the conference. And I think he has an article in the book. So here's how Mumford summarizes his agenda. This is basically the opening line. He says, the natural history of urbanization has not yet been written, for only a small part of the preliminary work has been done. The literature of the city itself, until a half century ago, was barren to the point of non-existence. So in other words, urban studies only began basically in the 20th century, he says. And even now, this is 1955, the ecologists of the city, by which he means environmental scholars, dealing too largely with a late and limited aspect of urbanism, have hardly staked out the ground that is to be covered. Our present purpose, accordingly, is to make use of such studies as have so far been made in order to ask more pointed questions and so to indicate further fields of profitable study. So it's a little bit like Lewis Worth when he said that, the current state of urban sociology is disappointing and I better get involved because I need to contribute more. Mumford's basically saying we really don't understand in 1955. Today, I think we understand a lot better. We still have a lot of work to do. But he was saying in 1955, the field of urban studies was only founded 50 years earlier, he says, and not very many people are really dealing with environmental and ecological processes. So he's kind of like, let's see what we know. And then he launches into his natural history of cities and urbanization. And it's a pretty amazing essay. Even today, when this field is now very well established, the generalizations he makes, the questions he poses, and the positions he takes, which are ultimately political positions, are quite provocative. He considers the history of cities and urbanization not just as a social process, the way that Zimmel, Worth, and in many ways, at least in the essay that you read for Tuesday, Harvey did, but rather questions about non-human nature, landscape, environment, non-human life. The core claim, very simple but far-reaching proposition, is that city building is premised upon a remaking of the non-human world. We might simply say, even though it's not his terminology, a metabolic rift. I want to argue, basically, this is the argument I'm going to make in the next 15 minutes. Lewis Mumford is basically deploying a version of metabolic rift theory. I'm going to explain. The remaking of the non-human world is disruptive to both human beings and to the non-human world itself. And he basically gives an historical account of the different metabolic rifts. Again, not his term, but he may as well have used it. He's giving an historical account of the different metabolic rifts and their escalating destructive consequences for human and non-human life during the history of human life since the Neolithic era. So it's breathtaking. It's like wow, that's kind of a crazy thing to try to do, but he did it, and he offers some generalizations that are, at least get us conversation started. There's a lot of emphasis on the metabolism of materials, especially food and water, but also energy and the management of waste. And again, as I just said, the thing that for me is just remarkable about the essay, but mainly because it's inspiring. In other words, these are things we need to understand building on this and maybe other frameworks. He historicizes it. So the whole point I was making in my opening remarks about historical nature, it's not just historical urbanization, but also historical environments, historical natures. Mumford is basically illustrating that, it seems to me, very, very concretely. The nature is not just an exterior realm that cities draw from and then mess up, as it were, through their waste products. But nature is itself, natures in the plural, are being transformed through particular patterns and pathways of urbanization during the history of the world. So let me now just summarize before I show this slide. What I'm going to do is give you a quick summary of some of the broad generalizations he makes about this natural history of urbanization from the Neolithic period all the way up to the modern period. And I'm just going to draw out the point that I made about how he's suggesting that there are metabolic rifts that escalate and become progressively more destructive both to human beings and to non-human environments. So pre-capitalist urbanization, the generalization that Mumford makes is that there was a symbiotic, that's his word, relationship between the city and the land, the city and the hinterland. He claims, for example, that city size until relatively recently in human history was severely restricted by the need to secure food from territorial hinterlands that were pretty close, because you just couldn't transport the food and also protect the fields from invaders if you located them too far away. So the claim that Mumford makes, which I find really quite astonishing and indeed very plausible, is that it's actually the situation of the hinterland that constrains city development for most of human history. Because you can't have that many people clustered together in the city, let's say doing hand manufacturing or doing cultural activities or doing educational activities or whatever else we do in the city, unless you can feed everybody. So there's like a threshold of population that changes over time, but for the most part, it's very hard to get beyond a certain threshold unless you've solved the food question and the water question. And again, if you look at the history of city building over the millennia, including like famous examples from the West, like Rome, the problem of water supply in the Roman Empire, the aqueducts, the problem of food supply, like all the commercial maritime routes in the Mediterranean, there are attempts to kind of break out of those limits by creating elaborate social, technological infrastructures to supply water, to supply food. And that also involves empire and control over land and control over labor, because somebody's got to do all the work to farm it and then to bring it to the city. So it becomes basically like, you might think of it as like a logistics of urbanization. It's a logistics of the metabolism, because supplying the city population with their needs requires logistical command over the proximate hinterland, and to the degree that you're going to grow the city to a larger size, larger and larger territories. He suggests that, that agricultural innovation, enhanced productivity in the fields, does permit the expansion of city size, and that's part of what enables larger cities to grow, again, in different parts of the world. He talks about the West mostly, but one can make the same argument about large cities in other parts of the world system, South Asia, East Asia, China, the Middle East, and so forth. I mean, it's a fascinating question where suddenly we're looking at the relationship between, we're looking at cities and urban development in relationship to broader territories, hinterlands, and problems of food and water supply. And of course, the military control and protection of what we would today call the supply chains to facilitate all that. So he says, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but it's pretty amazing. It's kind of I want to just draw your attention to the quote on the right. He's basically talking about how agricultural productivity enables cities to grow. And I'll just read what I underlined, which against the background of Zimmel and Wirth, it's pretty interesting. He says that the tendency of cities to grow along rivers or near accessible harbors was furthered not alone by the need for easy transport, but by the need to draw on aquatic sources of food to supplement those produced by the soil, so seafood. This rich and varied diet may itself have contributed to the vital energy of city dwellers as contrasted with the more sluggish ways of hinterlanders. So I just find that amazing, because Zimmel and Wirth are kind of saying, oh, it's the conditions of the city you know, the density, the heterogeneity, and the size that contribute to this kind of way of life. And Mumford kind of slips in this argument here without mentioning Wirth or Zimmel, and says, well, actually, they ate well. they had a more varied diet, and it was because they had a healthier diet that they had more energy instead of those sluggish hinterlanders who, I don't know, had to subsist on potatoes, you know, tubulars. If you just eat tubulars, you don't have the energy to have like an energetic city life. But if you have access to seafood, says Mumford, I mean, I say this as a longtime vegan, so I don't know. I have a lot of energy as a vegan, but we won't go there right now. But it's a fascinating argument. It may be true. I mean, I think the metabolism of labor, obviously of human labor, requires nutrition. So I actually take the question seriously. I don't know if his generalization is right, but the proposition is just, I'm chuckling just because it's just such a fascinating counterpoint to the kind of argument that we hear from Zimmel and Wirth, where it's like, oh, it's all social. It's about the interaction and the conditions of the social interaction. And Mumford's kind of saying, well, they had a more varied diet, and so they had more brain power and more energy. It's worth thinking about, but he just kind of throws that in there as like a side comment, and it's kind of it gave me a little pause. So okay, so let's go further. So metabolic rifts, from this symbiotic relationship, some metabolic rifts kick in. And he says, he calls it urban displacement of nature. I would suggest we just call it a metabolic rift. He says, as the disintegration of one civilization after another reminds us, the displacement of nature in the city rested in part upon an illusion, or indeed a series of illusions as to the nature of humans, he says man, today we would just say humans, and their institutions. And what is this illusion? The illusions of self-sufficiency and independence, and of the possibility of physical continuity without conscious renewal. Under the protective mantle of the city, seemingly so permanent, these illusions encourage habits of predation or parasitism that eventually undermined the whole social and economic structure after having worked ruin in the surrounding landscape and even far distant regions. So there's a lot to be unpacked here, but I have to do it relatively efficiently because I have some ground I still want to cover. He's basically saying that living in the city, this apparently artificial, self-sufficient environment, gives people the illusion of permanence because they're disconnected. He's talking about the 19th century, by the way, not about our time, but he could also be talking about our time. They're disconnected from the biological and biogeophysical processes that sustain us. And thus we have the illusion that we can keep growing and developing and consuming endlessly. And he says that wreaks havoc not only upon the social structure, but on the landscape. Because that's not, I mean, he doesn't use the term, but he's basically saying it's not sustainable. He says, though man has become the dominant species in every region where the city has taken hold, partly because of the knowledge and the system of public controls over both man and nature he exercises there, he has yet to safeguard that position by acknowledging his sustained and inescapable dependence upon all his biological partners. Powerful statement. He's basically saying, again, the human beings in these big cities feel that like, okay, we've dominated nature. We have all that we need and we can just keep living this way. He's saying this is an illusion. It's an ideology. It masks our dependence upon what Charles Darwin famously called the web of life. The web of life. City is part of the web of life. City changes the web of life. The city, all cities and processes of city building hinge upon that broader, the biological partners. That could be the microbes in our stomachs. It could mean the bees that pollinate the fruits that we eat. It could mean all kinds of factors that affect the unbuilt environment of plants, vegetation, weather, and non-human life. And Mumford is saying we need to be much more aware of that web of interdependence. And he says that, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but basically there's no longer this symbiotic relationship with the surrounding territory, and that after a certain growth takes place in defiance of natural limitations by a more intensive occupation of the land and by encroachment into the surrounding areas with the subjugation by law or naked force of rival growing cities bidding for the same resources. So, so basically a kind of overshoot argument. The more complete the urbanization, the more definite is the release from natural limitations, the more highly the city seems developed as an independent entity, the more fatal are the consequences for the territory it dominates. So it's an argument basically about ecological imperialism. Again, it's not his term, but that's basically what he's saying. The more the city develops, the more it devastates everything around it. He thinks city building is incredibly destructive, both to eventually, as we'll see in a moment, life within the city, but immediately to the surrounding hinterland. It just consumes without regenerating everything around it. And as the supply chains that support the city grow, the scale of that destruction, the scale of that metabolic rift becomes ever more colossal. So I'm going to skip. No, I got it. So look, I've just got a few minutes. But basically what Mumford is saying is that particularly in the 19th century, there's a particularly radical upscaling of this metabolic rift. Please take note, everyone. The metabolic rift, this destructive relationship that I've been summarizing, doesn't begin with capitalism or with 19th century capitalism. For Mumford, he thinks it goes back quite a while. But he does believe that with the 19th century, there's a particularly drastic scaling up of that ecologically destructive dynamic. And he says basically that there were previously 4 natural limits on the growth of cities related to adequate food and water supply, protecting the city militarily, transportation limits, and then limits related to the supply of energy when you're relying on water power. And what he says is that with the 19th century, with the introduction of essentially coal, fossil, what I would call and others would call fossil urbanization, steam power, those limits are exploded. Coal replaces water and wind and animal muscle, you get mechanization. Transport is no longer water and animal muscle, you get rail, powered by steam, and later by oil. This completely reconfigures the relationship between cities and hinterlands, the food supply, the water supply, the material supply, and the waste processing. It's basically like a deterritorialization. The contiguous hinterland in some cities up to this day may still supply some of the food and particularly water. A lot of our water is obviously regionally supplied, certainly in Chicago that's true. But energy is probably one of the most deterritorialized hinterlands. Again, it depends on the location, but to the degree that we're relying on fossil fuel in the Midwest, it's coming from the tar sands as all the, the struggles over the Standing Rock and the Keystone XL pipeline between, Trump trying to roll it forward and Biden now trying to shut it down. Similar kinds of debates in other parts of the world related to the energy supply. Mumford also makes the point, very profound, that with and others have made it as well in the wake of Mumford's observation, it's very fundamental. Previously, the biggest cities in the world, almost without exception, throughout human history, almost without exception, were either on coasts or on inland waterways. Just because of the need to, the ways in which water power and water transport can supply the city with various kinds of inputs and take away various outputs. But with the development of steam power and thus the railroad, that particular constraint is exploded. You can build very large cities in places that aren't near a water body because you just have to put, like, think of Denver, Colorado. Like, it's a big city that grew like in the wake of the railroad because they decided to route the railroad through Denver, and it becomes one of the big, cities of the US West. And other examples like that all over the world, in different so-called landlocked places. So the whole geography of urbanization, it changes not just in terms of the scale, but actually the geographic location. The size and the consequences of this for Mumford are devastating. The size of the cities explode. So what we're going to read about for Tuesday, the megalopolis. So the earlier size constraint for a while, biggest cities in the world for a very long time hovered at a couple 100,000 people and then 1 million people. And those were exceptions. And suddenly with the growth of coal power, steam, and then eventually oil, you get proliferating very, very large cities. There's a lot of reasons behind that. It's not just about energy. It also has to do with the way modern capitalist industrial production is organized, which we'll talk about another day. But equally important, I really want to emphasize this, everyone, For Mumford, what I think is really profound is that this transformation isn't just manifested in new kinds of cities. In order to build these big megacities with industrial capitalism, the megalopolises, you're also reorganizing hinterlands. You're using mechanized production, let's say in agriculture, in order to increase the productivity of the processes that generate many of the metabolic inputs, whether it's energy, whether it's materials, whether it's food, and then of course the processing of waste. So mechanization changes the way that entire territories and landscapes are organized. It's not only manifested in the big cities. And very presciently, in 1956, Mumford is basically telling us that this entire form of urbanization involves a massive externalization of waste products into the biosphere in a way that's incredibly destructive. And Mumford is polemicizing against this process at every scale. In his other writings, he writes about the New York City region and how urban development, mega urbanization in New York City is destroying the landscape. It's destroying the forests, it's destroying the Hudson River. But he also makes the same point at much larger scales. He talks about the extinction of the right whales in the ocean because of overfishing and because of the, the lust for the products of the whale in relation to luxury consumption and industrial production in the big cities. So he says it's a catastrophic metabolic rift. The new source of power, coal, the new industrial processes massed in the steel works and the coke ovens, the new chemical plants for manufacturing, chlorine, sulfuric acid, and hundreds of other potentially noxious compounds, they poured their waste products into the air and waters on a scale that made it impossible for the local environment to absorb them, as it might have absorbed the effluvia of a village industry or the organic waste of a tannery or slaughterhouse. So it's literally this image of like overflow, the waste, the externalization of material and pollution generated by these cities is just literally, the entire world outside the city is just treated as a waste dump. Whether it's the atmosphere, whether it's the immediate hinterland, in this particular moment, it's just simply externalized with incredibly destructive consequences. And again, this is an incredible passage, 1956. He says, streams hitherto well stocked with fish, salubrious for bathing, and even potable, became poisonous sewers, while the fall of soot, chemical dust, silica, and steel particles choked vegetation in what open ground remained and left their deposits in human lungs. The effects of this pollution and the possibility of more radical and irretrievable pollution to come through the use of atomic reactors are dealt with in other chapters of the book. So again, he's writing this in 56, but it's an incredibly contemporary kind of statement. So I'm out of time, but basically I was gonna play a clip from Blade Runner 2049, and I would if y'all wanted to stay for another 5 minutes, but I'm not gonna ask you to do that. But basically, extra credit. So Blade Runner 2049 is set in a world in which the consequences of that kind of a dynamic that I just quoted from Mumford, this kind of constant externalization of all the byproducts of industrial mass urbanization onto the city, but also onto the non-city. The whole film plays out in a world, and a world of cities, but also hinterlands that have been devastated through ecological collapse. So I don't know if how many of you have already seen Blade Runner 2049? Anybody? A couple? So if you've seen it, watch it again in light of Mumford and in light of the metabolism. If you haven't seen it, you might need to read up a little bit about Blade Runner 1 just to understand what's going on in terms of the idea of the replicant. There's a bunch of people in the movie who are basically non-humans. They're kind of like robots. And the thing is set around, it's kind of a reflection about nature, the human being, the non-human. But I invite you to see Blade Runner 2049 and relate it back to the class. And part of why I put this particular still up is just because the cinematography of the film, I just find incredibly powerful. The first one as well, but for this one, it's really a powerful reflection on basically the metabolic rifts and their consequences of industrial capitalist civilization. So I would encourage you to write about whatever you want if you do this extra credit, but really give some attention to the cinematography. So basically, I'm out of time, I gotta stop. And the last part of the lecture, which I'm just gonna have to skip, I was gonna talk a little bit about Mumford has some proposals for how to heal the metabolic rift through urban planning and creating a sort of circular regenerative metabolism. But I'll try to return to some of those ideas at the very end of the term when we talk about ecological sustainability and the debate on resilient cities, where Mumford's ideas actually are pretty influential. These are maps from Ebenezer Howard, who was one of Mumford's, someone that he really admired as having a solution. And the idea was to kind of create a way to design not just cities, but territories, so that instead of externalizing all the waste, you would regenerate the city by essentially recycling all the byproducts. So he thought that planning on a regional scale, ecological planning on a regional scale, would provide the solution, or at least a way forward in relation to all these kinds of problems. He says, this situation calls for a new approach to the whole problem of urban settlement. Having thrown off natural controls and limitations, modern man must replace them with an at least equally effective man-made pattern. So basically, through design, through planning, coming up with a new relationship between human society, urbanization, and the non-human world that would be more regenerative, or in contemporary parlance, sustainable. So, okay, thank you all for staying. I did go over time, and I didn't even get into, I wanted to talk about Abel Wohlman and his approach to urban metabolism, but it's basically an attempt to quantitatively measure the some of the inputs and outputs. And yeah, let's bookmark it. For Tuesday, we've got to forge ahead and talk a little bit more about these cartographic approaches. And then we'll, Joshua and I will confer about our next steps beyond that, whether to do a day. We could still do a day where we just have a discussion, because there are a lot of loose threads here that we haven't been able to discuss. But for now, I wish all of you well. I'll stay in the room for a few minutes in case anybody has any follow-up inquiries. I wish everyone well. We'll read your reaction papers as usual and send you feedback. And yeah, I guess I'm obliged to leave it at that. Thank